Okay, great. I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for logging on for this discussion on lessons learned from the 2025 elections and the path to 2026. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Election Innovation and Research. My name is Joanie Greve, and I'm CEIR's Communications Specialist. As many of you know, CEIR is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works with election officials at the state and local level from around the country and from both sides of the aisle. We seek to support elections that voters should and do trust. Today, you will hear from David Becker, who is CEIR's executive director and founder. He has more than 25 years of experience in elections, having served as a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice's voting section in both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He also led the elections team at the Pew Charitable Trust prior to founding CEIR. You will also hear from Kyung, senior investigative correspondent at CNN. Kyung previously served as a senior national correspondent covering the 2024 presidential race, and she's extensively covered the disinformation campaign surrounding the results of the 2020 presidential campaign and the state level efforts to authorize those election results. I will hand the conversation over to David and Kyung in just a moment, but first I'm going to cover a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make that recording available after we conclude today. We will have some time for questions at the end of David and Kyung's discussion. At that point, I will ask you to please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to share your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. Thank you. And with that, I will hand it over to David. David, over to you.
Thanks, Joni. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for spending an hour of your Thanksgiving week with us. I should note this is one of our highest registration rates for any webinar, to which I entirely attribute that to Kyung Law, who is just a giant in our space, who I've known for several years now, and we're going to get into a conversation with her in just a minute. But as many of you know, she was on the ground in places like Arizona in 2021 as conspiracy theories were leading to potential violence and volatility, as election officials all over the state and all over the country were being threatened and harassed, and did some of the most important reporting on this. And I'm just very grateful for an opportunity to share her knowledge with you all. I just want to talk a little bit about where we are right now with American democracy. And the very first thing I should note is earlier this month, we held elections in many parts of the United States, as you know. There was a lot of disinformation. There was a lot of partisanship that swirled around those elections. But one thing we know for sure is those elections were run extraordinarily well, once again, by all of the public servants around the country, Republicans and Democrats both, who make sure we all have our voice. Results were clear. They were known fairly quickly. Very few problems existed. Where there was a problem, it was handled transparently and quickly, as it always has been done, as it has been done over the last several years. It's one of the reasons that despite what Kyung and I have seen with conspiracy theories and disinformation, and that in many ways has been ramping up, the work of election officials, again, Republicans and Democrats all over the country, has withstood all of that scrutiny and been proven to be diligent and competent time and time and time again. There was just a court case last week where an appellate court upheld the dismissal of a case brought by President Trump against CNN for using the term "the big lie" in its reporting. Once again, every time the election deniers, the conspiracy theorists have had a chance to present evidence that would prove their case, they've run away. They just don't have anything to show in court. And so, thanks. I looked at as I said, we've got hundreds of people on this webinar, but I've already recognized the names of dozens of election officials who are on this webinar. So if you are an election official or ever have been an election official, if you're anything from a Secretary of State down to a volunteer poll worker, thank you for all that you've done and continue to do. But as we talk about those conspiracy theories, we're seeing an uptick in those conspiracy theories, and we have to just be honest about that. We're seeing more and more false claims being made on social media, sometimes reinforced by things being said by the president or other members of his administration. We see criminals who've been convicted in state court, like Tina Peters in Mesa County, Colorado, who the president is pressuring the state to release into federal custody. She stole the identity of an innocent individual and then illegally accessed voting equipment, and a jury of her peers found her guilty, and she is sitting in a Colorado state jail right now. Um, we have, as many of you probably note, the Supreme Court took a case out of Mississippi, out of the Fifth Circuit, that will decide whether or not ballots that were cast on or before Election Day, all of the ballots that we're talking about are being cast on or before Election Day, but placed in the mail and are postmarked and arrive after Election Day, whether or not states have the right to allow those ballots to be counted. The Fifth Circuit was the first court in the history of the United States to say no, and the Supreme Court is taking that case. I just want to stress we don't know what that means. There's a lot of people who are speculating. I think we should be careful about predicting what that means because it could be that there are at least four justices who think the Fifth Circuit should be overturned. It could be that there are at least four justices who think that the Fifth Circuit's decision should be the law of the land. I think we're going to have to just wait and see how that plays out. But one thing that I think is really important, I think people often equate ballots coming in faster with getting results faster. And I would just caution against that because the single biggest variable in determining whether when the media can declare a race is the margin of victory. It's not when the ballots come in. And that's why in a place like California, which is where I used to be from, and maybe we'll go back, they can declare the winner of the presidential race at 8:01 p.m. when the polls close, but it's going to take weeks for close congressional races to be determined. That's not because the number of ballots cast are different. It's just because the margins are much more narrow in those congressional races. So we should just keep that in mind with regard to expectations. And then lastly, I just want to note I know the redistricting cases are on everyone's mind. The Texas redistricting case, a three-judge court again ruled 2-1 that the Texas redistricting violated the Constitution because race predominated over all other traditional redistricting principles like political geography, other geography, communities of interest. That decision was written by a Trump-appointed judge. Justice Alito stayed that case on Friday. I would also caution that means nothing. That's very normal. He's just waiting for the full court to come in and decide what to do with it. We'll see what the court does with it. But whatever they do, hopefully it will happen very quick because election officials and voters need to know. But lastly, I just want to make another point, and it's something we might talk about in our conversation with Kyung. The Justice Department, for the first time in American history, is acting as an arm of the Trump campaign and as the president's personal lawyer in a way that we've never seen before. The Justice Department, the place I used to work, is not the president's lawyer. You don't take an oath to the president of the United States when you work at the Justice Department. You take an oath to the Constitution of the United States when you work at the Justice Department. And you serve the American people. It is the law firm for the American people. And to see a Justice Department doing a variety of things which are highly controversial, and most of you probably have heard now that the indictments against Letitia James and James Comey uh, have been dismissed without prejudice due to probably some significant problems with how the DOJ conducted itself. You also see the DOJ actively trying to support the Texas redistricting while actively opposing the California redistricting. And those two things are fundamentally in conflict and can only be resolved, only be reconciled with the recognition that this is entirely partisan. So that kind of is a lay of the land. I've talked too long already, and you want to hear from Kyung. So why don't we start there? You and I have talked before about this, and I think it's interesting to kind of go back to 2020 and 2021, which in many ways, I don't think it's the very beginning of this, but it's certainly where a lot of the conspiracy theories and the attacks on democracy caught a lot of steam. Um, maybe for those who on the call on the Zoom who don't really know what you were doing, can you talk a little bit about what you were doing back then, where you were and what you saw and the people you worked with?
So I agree. 2020 wasn't the beginning of it. It started much sooner than that. But 2020 is when it clicked for me as a battleground correspondent. We have in that era of time, I was doing quite a bit of politics, especially in battleground states like Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, all of these states, Wisconsin. I was spending a great deal of time in them. Because I am based in Los Angeles, I was spending much more time. Geography does matter. I could get there much more quickly in Arizona and in Nevada. And in Arizona, which was such an important state and remains such an important state for our politics and for the future of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. I was there, and you may or may not remember before January 6th, some of the people who were most visible during the January 6th, um, what was happening at the Capitol. The man with the horns, the QAnon shaman, he's from Arizona. I actually saw him a couple months before in November. And certainly he was as remarkable back then as he was in January. And that was the moment when I was in the nondescript building, standard county building. I had been there many times before, watching the ballots come in, seeing senior citizens, all with gray hair, some, like your grandmother, counting the ballots at adjudication tables. And suddenly somebody came in. I mean, these doors are open to the public. Anyone could come in just like the press could. And that's when I realized, with the ferocity and anger and what I was hearing, the language that was used, the stop the steal language, the stop the count, all of this was happening right before my eyes, and I had not heard that before. And then the building was surrounded by people carrying rifles. That was the moment visually where I realized that conspiracies and lies about how ballots are counted, how, what device pen is used to fill in the holes of your ballot, all of that had somehow permeated into the public and right before my eyes. The sheriff's department was called in. They were wearing riot gear trying to protect volunteers and hourly paid workers, again, retirees who were counting ballots. And so that to me was the significant turn. Following that was January 6th.
Yeah.
Following that was the recount, the audit. And so it was just this build, as David was talking about.
Yeah, and it strikes me also. I mean, I remember I was sitting in a CBS studio on election night in 2020, and it was, we forget it was COVID was still raging across America. It was a very conspiracy-rich environment. And then at 3 a.m. or so Eastern time, the president of the United States came out and on national television on every network said the election was being stolen. When in reality, what you were seeing actually being on site, and what everyone in elections knows is every election official in America was just going through the somewhat plodding process of actually counting every ballot and making sure every batch of ballots was accounted for. And I thought, Arizona was this weird kind of center for where the old school media and the president's claims, and then also the conspiracy theories that were swirling on social media, created this really volatile environment you just described in for actual human beings, right? In members of the media, workers in the election office, election officials, other public officials. Can you talk a little bit about you met so many of those people in Arizona who are doing this work, who probably didn't think they were going to need to be brave on a daily basis. Can you talk? I mean, we've talked about this before, but I'd love everyone else to hear a little bit about like the people you got to know over time in Arizona.
Well, going back to that building that was surrounded, that building now has intense security. It has gates, it has layers of entrance, different key cards you have to swipe in. It is not accessible anymore. Just for anyone to walk in, there has to be levels of clearance. It's still a public building, but there's a reason why that exists, and it's because of what happened in 2020. And then what I didn't know at the time, that it would balloon into threats against election officials. And it didn't just happen in Arizona. In Colorado, you had what county was it? The election worker who was wearing the bulletproof vest, who had bulletproof glass placed at the front office. Do you recall what county that was?
I don't remember the county. I know what you're talking about, though. There
Yeah.
were
So
similar scenes in Michigan. Similar, yeah. It was,
right.
yeah.
In this, in Michigan, who can forget that people were pounding on the glass as people were counting, and Philadelphia had its own unbelievable swirl. So the people who were preventing all of that madness from interfering with the actual count are normal administrators, election administrators, unremarkable people, sort of your classroom math whiz, or somebody who would have his or her pencil sharpened at the front row. Stephen Richer, a self-proclaimed, he was at the time the Maricopa County Recorder. He was leading and winning in 2020. He jumped into this defending the election space. He's a Republican, a very conservative
And
Republican.
actually, he wasn't the sitting recorder. He had just
Oh, sorry,
defeated.
he won that night. Sorry.
Yeah, he was
But
a Republican who had defeated the sitting Democrat, and they joined together to defend the
agreed.
system. With,
Yes.
remarkable.
This
Yeah.
is why I have editors. But yes, David remembers better than I do. Yes. Adrian was losing to Stephen Richer. So you had this transfer of power. And then, there was on the left, there was concerns about what would Richer do. Richer ended up being one of many, many Republicans and Republican election officials in this country who withstood the most abuse from their own party. They lost friends. Um, Bill Gates has publicly talked about on the board of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. He suffered through PTSD. So they had to suddenly, these ordinary people who don't make a lot of money had to install security in their homes and cameras. They were now living with their children being threatened.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones who prevented that chaos from affecting the count, and they paid a price personally.
Yeah. I mean, Bill, for those who aren't familiar, Bill Gates was the former Maricopa County supervisor, former Arizona Republican Party election integrity lawyer, a longtime Republican fixture in Arizona, now runs Arizona State University's Mechanics of Democracy Lab. Just the very epitome of a public servant, and he and his family were threatened. Um, Stephen Richer, his wife has been threatened. Um, the people like Rusty Bowers, former Speaker of the Arizona House, we talked about this before, Kyung. I mean, this is a man who, again, he truly is a fixture in Arizona Republican politics for a long time, and just an incredibly his resume of standing up for conservative principles in the state of Arizona is hard to match. And because he just stood up for the truth and for other public servants in his state, he was ostracized and threatened. I mean, we can go look there even down to the Governor Ducey declining the call from the White House while the electoral votes were being certified in the Arizona State Capitol in December. It was quite a scene that you found yourself in the middle of. I mean,
And if you
yeah,
fast forward, right, you had
yeah.
Republicans battling Republicans during the Arizona audit. And this partisan audit recount, you had certain state house, very, very prominent, powerful state Republicans battling with county and congressional Republicans. It was an extraordinary battle, and it was all over the truth.
And you had a front row seat for that. You were there for the Cyber Ninjas audit um, in the Veterans Coliseum, where I mean it was you describe. I'll let you describe what you saw while you were there. For this. But I mean I think everyone knows we do audit. That Arizona election had already been audited when the Cyber Ninjas came in. And that audit meant that officials, bipartisan teams, transparently looked at the paper ballots, hand counted batches of them, and compared them to the machine counts to make sure that everything matched and confirmed that the machines had counted them properly. And then in come the cyber ninjas, and I'll let you take it away from there.
And as far as the audit, the traditional normal audit that the county did, generally we didn't cover that because it was so rudimentary
Right.
and it was frankly very boring. So all of a sudden, there's this outrage and conspiracy over needing an audit that was very, very confusing. And it was local news. I'm going to say this till the day I die. It is local news that began covering this with such veracity. The local paper in Arizona, in Phoenix, as well as the TV stations, the political reporters were sending images, and you could see it as it was unfolding in front of you. The most bizarre scene. If you don't recall what it was basically a gym floor of the stadium that was covered with different tables that to this day it still looks like used Chinese restaurant to me. It was my mother's favorite restaurant in Chicago. We would go and they'd have these giant circular tables where you would have the lazy Susan and spin
Yeah.
everything around. That's exactly how it looked, but color coded with different volunteers. And so that was what they were calling the recount, the audit, and it was so odd.
And even after all that, even after the unprecedented access they had to all of the paper ballots, even with a process that they themselves designed, they could not find a different outcome than what the professional election officials did after months of fundraising and grift throughout that. And I think you raise a really good point. I mean, it's so hard for us to allow ourselves to go back there, but where we were in late 2020 and even early 2021 before vaccines became readily available. And I mean, the people who are traveling like you and being around other people, election workers, were putting themselves at risk just to be like, you can't run an election socially distant. You need, transparent teams. You need a whole bunch of people around. I was not traveling. I didn't travel. I didn't travel probably between March of 2020 and May of 2021. So I was relying, and so many others, on your reporting, on the reporting of so many other brave national reporters. And then, as you pointed out, these local news outlets, TV and print, that were absolutely crucial. I was reading the Arizona Republic every day. I was watching local TV news clips. I mean, it kind of gets me to think about kind of what the current media environment is and whether we'd be able to replicate that again, because even just in the last 4 or 5 years, the media environment has changed so much. Even things like Twitter/X aren't what it used to be. You have a unique insight into that. Um, Working for a major news outlet, one I think that is still trusted by many, but is it being attacked as untrustworthy by so many as well? What do you see in the current news environment?
Well, I remain very proud to work at CNN. I think the work that we still continue to do in challenging authority, in keeping the American public informed about what is happening with the administration. Um, I don't think that has wavered. We have continued to do that. Has it become more challenging? I think certainly if you're looking at the headlines, there is obvious pressure. There is very obvious pressure. There are obvious corporate pressures. But I'm going to quote my boss here that you just have to tune it out. You have to tune it out as a journalist because if you get stuck, and it is something that I think every journalist here is going to certainly know. If you worried every single day about what your ratings are, what your show producer is exactly angling for, you're going to lose yourself. You're going to not be able to fulfill your promise, which is to tell the truth as plainly and as honestly as you can. And so that has really remained our guiding light. It is certainly something that We work for, especially in the investigative unit, we are very buttoned up. We go through many layers of approval when we do any reporting. This has not changed. I go through an executive producer. I go through a show producer, wherever that may be. Now it's different layers of streaming, or there are different people who review. Then we go through standards, fact check, all lawyers, all of this. The process has not changed, but it has certainly that outside exterior noise. You certainly feel it. I think we all
Yeah.
feel it as journalists.
Well, and I think you hit on a key point, which I hope everyone kind of knows. There's, with the kind of trusted outlets, whether it be CNN, whether it be a broadcast news organization, or a trusted print source like, the New York Times, the Washington Post, um, Wall Street Journal, there are layers and layers of review that a story has to go through in order just to make it to the point where it can be published. Whereas so much of what people think is quote unquote news now are the instant reactions of social media influencers and others who measure their success in how much outrage they can generate. There was I heard this term, I didn't coin it. Someone told it to me, and it's a great term, rage farming. That this is now that there's basically everyone out there are rage farmers, and um, the journalists out there who are, honestly, um, sometimes people should be a little bit upset about what they're hearing from good media, because you shouldn't be exposing yourself only to media that you agree with. You should be challenged by the media you consume. And people like you and so many of your colleagues, and I've, the last 5 years that I've gotten to know, do such a remarkable job of that. I think under more pressures than I've ever seen before.
We're trying.
Yeah, I mean everyone who's listening. I mean, I hope subscribe to a trusted print media source, subscribe or watch video sources, expand your media profile out, like listen to things that you might not ordinarily listen to. Don't. It's healthy to read both the New York Times and Wall Street Journal's editorial pages. And disagree with some of it. That's entirely appropriate. But yeah, that's such a good point. Let me move on to a question, and you can feel free to ask me questions too if you want. I don't know if I probably don't have anything interesting to say, but uh, we're heading into over the next year probably one of the more pivotal years for American democracy in modern history. I know we always say that. Um, but and that's not, we weren't wrong before, but things are getting more volatile. And what are you worried about as we head into the next, into the midterm election year and where we might be in 2027?
I am in this coming midterm. I am worried about the pressure put on election administrators from outside forces, just broadly, whether that be misinformation, disinformation, um, or I mean, you referenced the Department of Justice. Is there going to be some type of a federal intervention? Is that something that is possible? What are the legal ramifications for that? We just don't know, right? It's a wild west at this stage. And when I speak with election administrators, they have a bunch of scenarios that they're laying out because now the imagination cannot be wide enough given what they have lived through in 2020, in 2022, in 2024 to
Mm.
some extent. So that is that is the biggest concern that I have, outside forces.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I hear that too when I talk to election officials all the time, and I know many are on this Zoom. Uh, it used to be that it was the Republican Party that really embraced federalism and the idea of state control over most legal processes, especially elections. And now we see this administration operate in such a way as to try to dictate policy to the states and local governments and elections, presumably because they think it's going to yield some kind of political outcome for them. And we see this in specific ways. I mean, we see the DOJ, without any congressional authorization or any federal law to back it up, pressuring the Ohio state legislature to change their deadline for receiving mail ballots. There's absolutely no justification for the DOJ to be effectively acting as a lobbyist for the President of the United States. The DOJ's jurisdictions is simply and only to enforce existing federal law. And could Congress pass a law that says all mail ballots have to be in by election day for federal elections? They absolutely could. They could also pass a law that says it's 5 days until they have to be in, and there should be drop boxes. But Congress hasn't done that. The Democrats have tried, it failed. The Republicans could try, they haven't. And the president can't do that. And that you see the DOJ operating in that way. You see the DOJ trying to seize sensitive personal data on every single voter in the United States, every voter's social security number, driver's license number, date of birth, the holy trinity of identity theft. Some states are succumbing. Indiana gave that data, just handed that data right over. That's an ongoing challenge. So,
I actually have a question for you,
yeah,
David, because
yeah,
you're talking about the DOJ. I mean, in this last election, we saw the Department of Justice saying it more loudly than actually through action, send people to California during the Prop 50 ballot to monitor.
yeah.
And so, what I'm curious about is that A, was it effective in your viewpoint? And is that something that you anticipate that you will see coming up?
Well, first of all, I- it depends on what the goal was for for the monitor exercises. I think two things can be true with these monitors, and I tried to put this into context. I think the partisan sides kind of got off in their own respective corners on this. Um, there was zero federal justification for sending federal monitors to purely state elections in 2025. If there had been some kind of indication there was going to be some kind of racial discrimination in voting, that might have provided some justification. But there wasn't in any of these cases. The places they sent them, as you know, Kyung, were exactly the same places the Republican parties in those two states in New Jersey and California asked. So there was no justification. But that said, it also wasn't a big deal. Like there were literally one or two lawyers in each of these counties. They might have spent just a few hours. I talked to election officials where they were. They didn't interfere with anything. They barely were aware of what was going on. It looks like they were well trained, and I am worried sometimes that some might intend to give the impression that federal monitors might be profiling voters or scare voters off because voters shouldn't be scared to vote. Fortunately, it doesn't seem like they were. We had pretty high turnout for an odd year election, especially in California, where for most places there was one thing on the ballot, just Prop 50. But voters shouldn't be scared of monitors. I think if the goal was to scare voters off, it wasn't effective. If the goal was to find evidence of fraud, it wasn't effective because there was no fraud that occurred, or if there was, it was extremely minimal and had no impact on the outcome. Um, so I think we have to be careful not to overreact to those kinds of things. But to your other question about what it portends for the future, we already know that it's going to happen in 2026 because there's one state, Michigan, where the GOP in Michigan has already followed the example of its colleagues in New Jersey and California and already asked for monitors for the 2026 election in Michigan. I mean, needless to say, we're over 11 months away from that election. I've never heard of that happening before. A number of Republican legislators in that state sent a letter to the DOJ asking for monitors and quote unquote complete oversight of the Michigan election. There is no provision for complete oversight of a state election by the federal government absent a court order. One of the reasons they gave for it is that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, a Democrat, is a candidate for governor in 2026. And so there is perceivably a conflict of interest. Problem with that is Secretary Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, a Republican, is doing the exact same thing. Secretary Scott Schwab in Kansas, a Republican, is doing the exact same thing. Secretary Brian Kemp in then Secretary Brian Kemp in Georgia in 2018 did the exact same thing, and there was no problem with any of it. That's completely fine. In fact, one of the signatories on the Michigan letter, I found this rather humorous, was a former Michigan Secretary of State who had literally overseen two elections where she was on the ballot herself. So, I think we're going to see some of this partisan gamesmanship more, but I think it's also really important not to overreact to that bright, shiny object. I mean, I think there are some who want to scare voters away from voting. And the best thing that we can tell voters is the absolute truth, which is no matter where you're voting, whether it's in California or Texas or anywhere else, voting is easy, it's convenient. There are lots of different options, and you should go express your preference regardless of who you're going to vote for. It's going to be as easy to vote in 2026 as it was in 2024 and 2022.
And since I can selfishly ask another question,
Please.
given that I'm in California, given the Texas decision, how does that impact California's Prop 50 vote? And then how does it impact other states? What is the ripple effect that you see now?
Yeah, this is a great question, and actually, there were some questions in the registration form along these lines as well, so you got ahead of them. So when Texas, let's go through a little bit about how this came about. Texas was resistant at first to do a mid-decade redistricting because remember the districts that were in place in Texas in 2022 weren't imposed on them by some liberal mafia. They were drawn by the Republican-dominated legislature and signed into law by Republican Governor Greg Abbott. This is a Republican gerrymander that has been in place for the last two elections. And so initially, when they were contacted by the White House and others, they were kind of reluctant to take on all of that work and do all of create that mess. And then the DOJ stepped in. And the DOJ sent a letter that is highly questionable legally, saying that their current maps violated the law for racial reasons, and they need to redraw those maps in order to comply with the Equal Protection Clause in the Voting Rights Act. That ended up being Texas's undoing because the court looked at that and said, see, you didn't do this for partisanship. You did this for racial reasons, and race predominated over traditional redistricting principles, and that's why it violates the Constitution. California, seeing this was going on, as you know very well, was figuring out whether they could do something because California has an independent redistricting commission that the voters have chosen to implement in California. And I know this very well because I served as voting rights counsel to the independent redistricting commission during this last round. So I know California's redistricting very well. And I'm incredibly proud because the districts that have been in place this decade in California were not challenged by anybody, not the Republicans, not the Democrats, not advocacy groups. They were so clearly legal and effective under the criteria, the nonpartisan criteria that California voters required, that they could not even be challenged. But in light of Texas's kind of brazen mid-decade redistricting and power grab, Texas or California Democrats felt they needed to fight fire with fire. And so they started Prop 50. And the first draft of Prop 50 basically did link the California redistricting to whether or not Texas passed, but that was ultimately taken out. So if Texas reverts back to its previous districts, in other words, if the gerrymander does not take effect, California's redistricting does take effect regardless, unless a court stops it. So the new districts that were passed as part of Prop 50 will be in effect for 2026 unless a court stops it. And I think it's very unlikely a court stops it
There
because
is a lawsuit.
there is a lawsuit. By the way, this is about the seventh lawsuit that has been brought by Republicans. They've kept they tried to keep it off the ballot, and they fought in federal and state court, and now they're trying to keep the districts from taking effect. But unlike the Texas redistricting, California was very clear from the very beginning that this was done for purely partisan reasons. You might not like that from a policy perspective, or people might not like that. And I do think these extreme partisan gerrymanders and mid-decade redistrictings are really bad. But partisan gerrymandering is a safe harbor in the Constitution. And as long as race doesn't predominate, as long as you don't violate the Voting Rights Act, and I don't think there's any credible allegation that either is occurring, those are likely going to be okay. And I think those new districts will be in place at least for 2026, unless California voters decide to revert back or something else. And I do hope that the mutually assured destruction of both parties being able to kind of game out extreme partisan gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court has been unwilling to wade into to this point. I hope that mutually assured destruction maybe causes both sides to back down a little bit. We're starting to see a little hope. We're starting to see Republican legislators in places like Indiana and Democratic legislators in places like Maryland saying we're not sure we want to be a part of this back and forth and tit for tat. And I hope that's where we get, but I do think it requires both parties to fight fire with fire until they can come to the table and say we're not going to do this anymore.
So it's just going to keep going until somebody says chicken.
I think that's probably right. I mean, the Supreme Court, I mean, look, I don't see any way the Supreme Court can uphold the Texas districts and overturn the California districts and retain any credibility whatsoever. There are probably people on this call who would say they've already lost all their credibility, there's certainly some questionable decisions out there. But I'm hopeful that the center of the court will take note of that. I think it's going to be very hard to overturn the lower court in Texas. I think it was a really well thought out decision. I happen to agree with with what they said there. I would like it for the court to say, as they haven't yet, they have said they don't like partisan gerrymandering, but they've said it's non-justiciable, that they can't do anything about it. And there are those out there who think that they can. There are those out there to think that there are some quantitative metrics that can define an excessive partisan gerrymander. I mean, California is going to have 5 districts that Republicans could conceivably win in a state out of 52, in a state where Donald Trump won nearly 40% of the vote. And Texas is going to have just a couple more districts out of 38, I think it is, where Democrats won 43%. Harris won 43% of the vote in 2024. That's probably not sustainable over time. Joanie, since it's 3:15 or so, should we get to some of the other questions on the that have been issued? And by the way, if you're out there and you'd like to submit a question, um, uh, please put it into the Q&A, and we'll be happy to take a look at it. Why don't I pick one here? So here's a question. How can we best inform voters and temporary election workers of federal actions and their impacts on our local state procedures? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Kyung. I think this is a very tight line we have to walk. I mean, I think, like I said, um, there are candidates and campaigns that in every election going back 25 years say they're going to have an army of observers at the polls, and they're often placed in certain places to make people think that they might have to be scared about walking a gauntlet or being profiled when they go to vote. And that has never materialized. And I always fall back on the voter themselves. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to scare voters away because in 2025, even with all of the threats to democracy, I mean, we saw just record turnout for an off-year election in every place that held it. Just to put it in perspective, um, New York City had about 1.2 million voters in 2021 vote in their mayoral election. That number was 2 million in 2025. I mean, they nearly doubled turnout in 4 years. People are showing up to vote, and that's great. So I think the best thing we can do is to keep telling them, look, 47 states have early in-person voting, other than Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. Every state has early in-person voting. 36 states offer mail voting without an excuse. Um, More states offer online voter registration, same-day voter registration, and automatic voter registration than ever before. It's easier to register than ever before. It's going to be easy to vote in 2026. Voters shouldn't be worried about that. And if I know this is something you'll agree with, one of the questions I get asked often is, what can we do? And the best thing you can do is volunteer to be a poll worker and see it all from the inside. Because back to your point about the audits, Kyung, I mean, there were those audits that happened with virtually no one watching them, right? That happened earlier in Arizona that confirmed the outcomes. And so people who were ill-informed thought this was done without transparency. And find someone who has doubts about the elections and recruit them to be a poll worker. Show them what it's like from the inside and all the transparencies and redundancies.
One of the things that I found very effective, and I still find extremely effective, especially as a journalist, is to simply put a mic on, the election administrator you want to talk to. A lot of them are, some of them may be very dry, but some of them are really amazing. Denton, Texas, the election administrator there, he's just this really funny big guy who wears Hawaiian shirts, and you can just put a mic on him and he can walk you through. And it makes a good story for you guys to walk through and show it together.
Yeah.
And I think allowing them to have their voice and you tell it in the best way, it does open things up for an audience to engage with the electoral process.
And you mentioned Stephen Richer before. I mean, he was, I don't know if you ever went,
Hilarious.
I mean, I don't know if you ever went on one of his tours. I mean, he was just omnipresent. I mean, he was anyone who wanted time inside the facility, he'd take them on a tour. Anyone, he would be on social media doing videos, taking people inside the operation. I mean, just tireless in that way. It was so great. And so many have done it, and yet they're still facing people who are, just lying about the election. I heard a conspiracy theory uh, just recently, because these things are upticking so much, um, that in Colorado, they didn't change the outcomes in the big counties, the big blue counties, because that would have been noticed. So they just shaved off, they just changed like 10% of the Trump votes to Biden votes in 2020 in counties like Mesa, which is on the western slope of in Colorado, and in Douglas County, which is just south of Denver. And one, all of those counties everywhere in Colorado, all paper ballots, and they audited them through risk limiting audits. But secondly, if you took every single Biden vote in those two counties, not 10%, every single one, and gave them to Donald Trump still loses Colorado by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of votes. And this is something like every one of these claims just fails on just like the obvious, when you look at it and just use the slightest amount of critical thinking. But I do think it makes such a difference when you get inside and meet the election officials. And Stephen Richer is no closet liberal.
No.
I mean, um, but he's just incredibly diligent about public service, and like just remarkably effective in that role. And we should note, got defeated by someone who has spread conspiracy theories in the primary in 2024, and that person is now the recorder in Maricopa County and has created problems and has created and has had some pretty big screw ups
I
in.
do, and actually, that is one of the other things that when you're asking about things that I'm worried about, the number of folks like that who are in legitimate positions of power at the local level. I, you know, I think that the system is quite strong, but I do wonder how much of that how much sand in the wheels could be thrown in.
Yeah, we saw a little bit of that in Shasta County this time around, where they weren't major problems, but these complete amateurs who were brought in by the kind of election denial board there to run elections over the experienced election officials. They didn't report results according to state law. They had other problems. They took too long to count. But fortunately, I will say, the number of places like that are not too great. I mean, in Maricopa, yes, the recorder's office is a potential problem, but the board of supervisors who shares election duties is still there, and they're doing such a remarkable job. In most in Georgia, the state board of elections has been problematic, but they have very little authority over actual elections. So there's only a handful of places where I think that's true. So hopefully, I mean, we're still seeing professionals running these elections to a large degree, but it's absolutely something we're gonna have to keep our eye on. I mean, you can imagine if there's a close congressional race that touches on Shasta County, and if it's a really closely divided House, how that could become a center of activity. Um, Here's a question that touches on the media landscape too. With AI capable of creating some very believable advertisements, how do you combat that misinformation? Do you have any thoughts on the kind of AI and disinformation landscape?
I mean, it's difficult, right? It is really, really difficult. Some of the my mother-in-law, my kids love to play with my mother-in-law on what is AI and what is not, and she fails 99% of the time. And I think that most people, like the younger people, are quite good at picking up what AI is. A lot of people struggle with it. And um, from what I've seen in the political, at least advertising sort of media, the online space, it's still obvious. I think it's still pretty abundantly obvious, but certainly people are going to fall for it. And all you have to do is just speak with as loud a voice as possible in your reporting to, try to correct the record. It's the same
Yeah.
way we deal with misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I will tell you, I'm not, experts in this will tell you that they're more worried about audio than they are video. I will also add, I'm much more worried about how AI can finally target information directed at someone personally. For instance, having a phone call or a voice message come from someone you think you know and trust, that's not actually them, it's AI generated. Um, People should just be overall incredibly skeptical. I'm not that worried about it from an election perspective overall for a reason that's not particularly optimistic. I think the disinformation environment is already awful without any AI generated activity. I think we're already just swimming in just a maelstrom of disinformation constantly. And what I say also, in addition to everything you've said, one of the things I really stress with people is break free of your media environments. Get out of your silos. Find places where you might be challenged, where you might disagree with stuff. Um, I see this all the time. It is the targeting worries me, not because it's targeting individuals and it might impact us individually. It's because we are all susceptible to bias, to our pre-existing biases, and a great example of this, Kyung, and you and I talked about this last week. There are conspiracy theories on the left. I
Oh,
mean,
100%.
there are widespread conspiracy theories that we're dealing really with quite a bit that Vice President Harris actually won the 2024 election and it was the machines that stole it. I'm seeing this. There was this conspiracy theory that said, look at Florida, where you look at the counties where turnout went higher. That turnout almost all went for President Trump. And I've been doing this a long time. I thought to myself, yeah, that's how elections work. The candidate that wins usually gets more voters. That's how it works. The candidate that people want to vote for get more voters. The candidate that people don't want to vote for gets fewer voters and people stay home. That's how it works. What we have is paper ballots. Those ballots, no one got a ballot without being pre-registered. When they were registered, they had to show ID. That's federal law. All of these things work, and yet we constantly see these things generated. And I hear from folks on both sides of the aisle saying, "I've heard these rumors about this election being stolen one way or the other." And it's interesting. Most of the people who claim elections are stolen go quiet when their candidate wins.
And I think very simply within your own newsrooms, if there are media folks here on the line, rely on your editors. And if you're at a small media outlet and you don't have an immediate editor handy, rely on your reporter colleagues. In stories that I do, I will reach out to the nearest expert within my newsroom, and they don't have to be somebody who was working on that story day to day. They may have a different outside view. That is something that is invaluable. We need to look to each other.
Yeah, I mean, this is elections are really, we're very blessed right now. We have this incredible core of media who've really learned about how elections work. You and so many others are your colleagues, but elections inherently are really esoteric. We don't do them all that much. I mean, your work is not just about elections. You're doing investigations and all kinds of stuff, right? So to gain the kind of knowledge about how these very esoteric, quite frankly, sometimes dull policies and procedures work is really valuable. And if you can do it as a citizen and support it, if you can do it as a journalist and support it, we have more than ever before. So again, thanks to you and all of your colleagues. I think the last question we're going to take is, and I'll ask you first, and then I'll talk about it at the end. Is we have a lot of election administrators on this webinar right now. I looked at the names. They are Republicans, they are Democrats, they are coast to coast. What should be their one big takeaway from this Zoom?
Just to do your job the best you know, and to not be afraid to talk to reporters. But talk to reporters who are going to give you your voice. I would just be highly cautious with somebody who comes in with a preconceived notion of what the story should be.
Mhm.
And just, you know, the other thing is, and I have advised this to some election administrators, is you also, given how the media landscape is, you can take your phone and you can do a vertical video and you can take your audience, your voters with you on your journey, and we will watch that as well. And we may follow up with additional questions with our own requests for interviews. But I think election administrators have so much power in today's media landscape that they can take their own story and share it with us.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard first of all, that's absolutely right, and transparency is incredibly important. I know a lot of election administrators also feel like, you know, they're screaming from a street corner, and you know, there are social media entrepreneurs out there who have a megaphone that reach the entire planet, and that's one of the challenges they face. But back to your original point, all the more reason to talk to reporters. I mean, it used to be 10 years ago that election officials would get very nervous when a reporter would call, and wonder what was going wrong. And now so many I've seen are really engaging with reporters and proactively going out to their local media to talk about what they're doing in advance of an election, not just talk about it if there's a problem. I think that's absolutely right. I think the other big point I'd want to a takeaway I'd love to have everyone who's an election official or a poll worker or prospective poll worker or even just a voter is there are people that have your back. I mean, I'm out there. I used to be the guy who would show up in election offices and say, "I'm with the Justice Department. I'm not here to help. I'm about to sue you." And people were not happy when they saw me, election officials usually. And then I learned what they did. I didn't, you know, I really didn't understand for my first couple of years in the Justice Department all of the hard work election officials do. And thanks to the election officials who I worked with and found ways, they all wanted to comply with the law. They all wanted to serve their voters. They all did that regardless of what the political outcomes were. And I started understanding that the people who run elections in this country are not some partisan hacks. They aren't incompetents. They are incredibly diligent public servants who often got into elections accidentally and found a calling. And they stay there regardless of the threats, harassment, and abuse that they're taking. And organizations like CEIR have your back. We will always be here for you. We run the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN.org. If any of you need a lawyer, you will get one provided to you at no cost if it's related to your duties. But people will have your back. It might get interesting over the course of the next year. But we're still going to be here. There are going to be reporters out there like Kyung who are doing stories on this and telling your stories where it gets where appropriate. And we're going to keep working on it. We're going to hold more of these webinars, so please keep engaged with us. With that, as we've got 1 minute, I just want to say, Kyung, thank you so much. It has been
Anytime.
wonderful to see you on just online today. I have so much respect and admiration for what Kyung does, and I'm so grateful for the reporting that I know so many of us rely upon. So please tune into CNN and watch her. With that, let me hand it off to Joanie for any last thoughts.
Yes, thank you all for being here today, for attending this excellent discussion. Thank you to David and Kyung for such a great event. I'm also just going to quickly drop in some links to both David's LinkedIn and social media, as well as CEIR. So we've been posting regularly to those, and so I want to make sure that you're able to follow us. And also, we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to both the video of this event, and then I will include that stuff as well. Sorry, I'm having technical issues to copy this over, but And Kyung, anything as I'm struggling with that, anything else you would like to shout out
No,
before we
just
sign off?
thank you for having me. I think these conversations are very, very important. And we're all just trying to do the right thing in the defense of American democracy. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks,
And
everyone,
you
and happy Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful week with your friends and loved ones, and hopefully turn off, as much as we love media, turn it off a little bit, have some time. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Come
and
back.
we'll talk to you. We'll talk to you again soon.